Good morning, Your Excellency.
Good morning, Mr. Dhankar.
Very, very good morning to all of you.
Good
Dhankar
morning.
Sahab, namaskar, namaskar.
My
Nice to-
greetings to Ramesh ji, Jairam ji.
भाई साहब,
And let me tell you, Jairam ji in Rajasthan is the ultimate greeting. In
Well-
Rajasthan, we greet someone by calling Jairam ji.
Kamagani, sir. Kamagani. बहुत दिनों से देखा नहीं है, सिर्फ अखबार में पढ़ते रहता हूँ आपके बारे में.
नहीं, पर virtually तो मुलाकात होती रहती है ना. These are times of virtual behavior.
Many years ago, almost 25 years ago, Jagdish Dhankar ji and I used to meet regularly.
And I distinctly remember Jayashree ji visiting his house.
Yes.
And I disagree with him that he can be negligent with the house. He can be negligent with nothing at all.
बिल्कुल sir.
So we have
कैसे हैं, sir?
83 participants now, which is quite a good figure.
We used
83
to
participants.
actually, Dhankar Sahab and I used to meet very frequently, very frequently. Of course, that time he used to wear white shirt, white pant all the time. I think he was very active as a lawyer at that time.
See,
Very,
lawyer, I have been acting till I took oath
yeah, courts, yeah.
on 30th of July 2019.
Yes. So I'm so happy you could come, Dhankar Sahab.
And let me tell you, Jairam ji, it's always a pleasure and very satisfying to
Dhankar
associate.
Sahab always makes it a point to come to these sort of functions, to literary
Great,
talks and
great.
all.
Very
It is-
gratifying.
Yeah, very much. So very encouraging for us also.
Should we start, Mr. Ramesh?
Yes, absolutely. I am ready whenever you are.
Yeah. So we have 93 participants, which is quite a good number, I think. And growing, 94 now, and growing by the minute. So let me start. On behalf of the Birla Academy of Art and Culture, I extend a very warm welcome to all of you. Delighted to have with us today the Honorable Chief Minister, Governor of West Bengal, Shri Jagdeep Dhankar, Shri Jairam Ramesh, and Srimati Malvika Banerjee. On this day of Guru Purnima, we are blessed to have a rendition of Lord Buddha's teachings by the erudite Sri Jairam. My daughter Maitreyi Kandoi has been instrumental in arranging this event. So over to her.
Good morning, everyone. Birla Academy of Art and Culture is privileged to host Mr. Jairam Ramesh in conversation with Malvika Banerjee to discuss his latest book, Light of Asia, the book that defined the Buddha. A short introduction on our speakers today. Mr. Jairam Ramesh is presently a member of Parliament and chairman of Parliament's Standing Committee on Science and Technology, Environment, Forests and Climate Change. He has been Union Minister and has held several key portfolios. He is the author of several well-known books that include biographies of Indira Gandhi, P.N. Haskar, and V.K. Krishnan Menon, which won a prestigious award. Malvika Banerjee is the director of Tata Steel Kolkata Literary Meet, as well as literary meets in Bhubaneswar and Ranchi. She is director of Game Plan Sports Private Limited, and in 2011, she opened the popular handloom store By Loom to explore her passion of saris and the magic of India's handloom tradition. The format of the event will be Mr. Jairam Ramesh speaking for about 20-25 minutes, followed by a conversation with Malvika Di, and then we would like to open up the session to the audience. So if the audience has any questions, please put it in the chat box and Malvika Di will take them up as relevant. So over to you, sir. Thank you so much once again.
Thank you, Maitreyi. Thank you, Jayashree ji. Honorable Governor of West Bengal, Jagdeep Dhankar ji, Malvika Banerjee, and friends. I'm really delighted and privileged to be with you to this function organized by the Birla Academy. in the presence of the Honorable Governor. And this is the book that has just come out. It's The Light of Asia, the poem that defined the Buddha. And I'll be in conversation with Malvika Banerjee on this book. Now, The Light of Asia was a poem, an epic poem, 40,000 lines divided into 8 books. It was an epic poem written by Sir Edwin Arnold, a British Orientalist, that was first published in July of 1879. Very soon thereafter, it became a publishing sensation. Editions rolled out year after year in England, in Europe, in America, and then it came to Asia. It got translated into 14 European languages. It got translated into 9 Asian languages and got translated into something like 12 Indian languages, beginning with the very first translation into Bengali in 1885 by Girish Chandra Ghosh, the great devotee of Ramakrishna and the father of modern Bengali theatre. Now, the poem was very influential in a literary sense. It was very influential in a political sense. It was very influential in a cultural and social sense as well. And it defined for generations our image of the Buddha. Now, the reason why I wrote this book was, Buddha was basically a rediscovery of the 19th century. There was an archaeological discovery of the Buddha. There was a textual discovery of the Buddha largely by the Asiatic Society and its great members in Kolkata. And there was a literary discovery of the Buddha, which Edwin Arnold attempted and succeeded in his epic poem. The sources for the poem are many, but by dealing with the life of the Buddha, Edwin Arnold succeeded in making Buddha a popular figure across the world. In many ways, the fact that Buddha became such a sensation across the world, across continents, was in large measure due to the publication of this poem and its subsequent translation into different languages. A very large number of Indians, starting with Vivekananda, Tagore, Gandhi, Nehru, Dr. Ambedkar, and many other distinguished Indians of the 20th century were profoundly influenced by the life of the Buddha that was described by Sir Edwin Arnold. And in fact, India's only Nobel laureate, first Nobel laureate in physics, 1930, C.V. Raman, who did all his Nobel Prize work, incidentally, in the city of Kolkata, in the Indian Association for the Advancement of Science. Raman writes that one of the 3 books that influenced him the most when he was a teenager was Sir Edwin Arnold's Life of the Buddha, a poem, The Light of Asia, from which he derived the values of compassion, values of tolerance, values of sacrifice, values of renunciation, and so on. Now, my own view is that Sir Edwin Arnold was successfully popularized the life of the Buddha. The poem became a sensation largely because it focused on the humanity of Buddha, not on the divinity of Buddha. After all, Buddha became the Buddha by not following a Buddha. Buddha's message was, the light is within you. Be your own searcher. Be your own experimenter. And by minimizing the divinity, the miraculousness of Buddha, and by focusing on his humanity, the human values, Edwin Arnold made Buddha into a world figure. And Edwin Arnold made Buddha into a figure that was an inspiration to poets, to authors, to politicians, to scientists, and to social reformers. beginning in the early part of the 20th century, beginning in Kerala, then in the old Madras presidency, and subsequently in other parts of India. This social message of the Buddha got highlighted. And Dr. Ambedkar, of course, embraced Buddhism finally in 1956. But the message of the Buddha, the message of caste equality, the message of social reform, the message of doing away with caste prejudices and caste orthodoxy, as exemplified in this poem, became an inspiration for many social reformers, and hence it got translated into Malayalam, Tamil, Telugu, Marathi, Hindi, Punjabi, Assamese, Odia, and even Sindhi. So to a large generation of Indians who were still under political subjugation, Buddha was a figure of pride which gave Indians a sense of moral, philosophical, spiritual superiority over the British. But there was also a generation of Indians like Sri Narayana Guru and Dr. Ambedkar and Dharmanand Kosambi who saw in the life of the Buddha the message of caste equality, the message of social reform. To Vivekananda, to Gandhi, to Tagore, to Nehru, Buddha was a cultural icon. But to others like Ambedkar, Buddha was a
I think there's some technical hitch, right?
Yes, I'm just going to call him up. Just bear with me, please.
Yes, I've also just messaged him. So in the interim, I thought let me just say hello to His Excellency. Namaste.
Namaskar, namaskar.
Yes. So, as you were there last time and we had a similar discussion with Pavan Verma ji.
Yes.
So I just thought I'll use this time before Jairam ji joins us back to ask you about your, as a child, when did you learn about the Buddha and his teachings?
Well, let me,
Joining back.
Malvika ji, reflect on my legal profession. And yesterday I thought over it. The greatest contribution the organization is making was reflected in a Supreme Court judgment. I'll read a small para of it, and that applies totally to Dr. Jairam Ramesh also. And Supreme Court emphasized cultural importance of Sanskrit language. While doing so, they made a reflection, very significant reflection. I'm quoting from the Supreme Court judgment. A professor of Cambridge University is deeply engrossed in his studies in his calm chamber. An agitated English soldier enters the study room and accuses the professor in not sharing the trauma of war which he and many others like him are facing while fighting Germans. The professor calmly asked the young soldier, for whom is he fighting for? Quick comes the reply that he is defending the nation. The wise man, the professor, wants to know what is that country to defend, which is prepared to shed his blood. The soldier replies, it is the territory and its people. On further questioning, the soldier says, it is not only this, but the culture of the country which he wants to defend. The professor quietly states, that he is contributing to that culture. The soldier calms down, vows in respect to the professor, and vows to defend the nation with more vigor, the cultural heritage of his country also. All I wish to emphasize is culture is the ultimate essence of freedom. And the academy, the seeds of which were sown by dawn of Indian industry, visionary, you cannot imagine the farsightedness, both of them. And I happen to be belonging to their district also. Basant Kumar ji, Birla ji, and Sarla ji. We are beholden to them.
Thank you.
It
Thank
is
you,
on
sir.
incremental
Ramesh,
trajectory. It is on
Mr. Ramesh,
incremental trajectory.
Thank you, sir.
I find it very soothing, and I'm looking forward to a visit when
Of
we are
course,
past
yes.
COVID.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Mr. Ramesh, you are here. Thank
Yes,
you.
I'm back. Sorry, this is factors well beyond my control. I had a power breakdown
No, Ramesh ji,
in my.
Ramesh ji, as a former parliamentary affairs minister 30 years ago, I provided you some relief by giving what is known as a packaged legal input.
Thank you. So as I was saying, there was a generation of Indians like Vivekananda, Tagore, Gandhi, Nehru, who saw Buddha as a cultural icon, as a spiritual icon, as a philosophical icon. But there was also a generation of Indians of whom Dr. Ambedkar certainly was the most distinguished. But there were other social reformers like Sri Narayana Guru and others in South India who looked upon Buddha as a social reformer, as a political revolutionary, carrying with him the message of caste equality and breaking down the prejudices of caste orthodoxy. And that is one of the reasons why the Light of Asia became such a sensation in the subcontinent. Now, the other reason why I was mentioning before, we got cut off, the other reason why this poem is very important is because of the restoration of Bodh Gaya. Beginning in 1886, after this poem was published in 1879, and Sir Edwin Arnold's own visit to Bodh Gaya, a movement started in Bodh Gaya for transferring the control of the Mahabodhi temple, the site of Siddhartha's enlightenment, from the control of the Mahants, the Shivite Mahants, to the control by the Mahabodhi Society that had been started and established in the city of Kolkata in the later part of the 19th century by the Sri Lankan monk Angarika Dharmapala. And this agitation took almost 70 years. But at the end of it, in May 1953, finally, the control of the Mahabodhi temple was transferred from the Mahants to a joint committee of the Hindu community and the Buddhist community, which till today continues to manage the Mahabodhi temple, the site of the enlightenment of Siddhartha, when Siddhartha became the Buddha, the enlightened one. So it is because of the Bodh Gaya issue and the manner in which the Bodh Gaya dispute got resolved through painstaking negotiations in which Gandhi, Nehru, Rajendra Prasad, Sri Krishna Sinha, and many other leaders of the Congress, Indian National Congress, the Hindu Mahasabha, and many other social organizations, the Mahabodhi Society, were involved, that gave the poem the political importance. In fact, in May 1953, when the Mahabodhi temple control got transferred, verses from this poem were chanted at Bodh Gaya in 1953. A poem that was published in 1879 is recalled in Bodh Gaya as the Mahabodhi temple control goes from the Hindu community, from the Shivite Mahants to a joint committee of Hindus and Buddhists. And I think the manner in which the Bodh Gaya dispute was resolved is a lesson to all of us, how through negotiations, how through mutual understanding, we can resolve many other such disputes that are there in our country over sacred places. So without wishing to say anything more, I just would like to summarize by saying that this is a poem, the 1879 poem, that was very influential in making Buddha into a global figure. This was a period of growing disenchantment with the organized church. This was a period in which people were looking not for religion, but were looking for a system of personal ethics and personal morality. And they saw in Buddha not a god, they saw in Buddha a person who was giving them a spiritual, a philosophical, an ethical anchor at a time of growing religious doubt and at a time of growing economic prosperity. I am not a Buddhist, I am not a historian, I am not a Buddhist scholar, but like every Indian, I carry the Buddha in me. The Buddha is part of every Indian's life. And it is because of that fascination for the life of the Buddha that, this was the poem that I had read when I was a child. It remained with me. And I wanted to understand why this poem became such a sensation. Why did it get translated into over 30 languages? Why did it influence Vivekananda? Why did it influence Tagore? Why did it influence Gandhi, Nehru, Ambedkar? And why did it result in the revival, in the restoration of places like Bodh Gaya and subsequently Sarnath, the site where the Buddha gave his first sermon? So this is a history of not a personality, it's a history of a poem, but embedded in this history of the poem is also the history biography of the poet, Sir Edwin Arnold, who translated the Geet Govinda from Sanskrit to English. He translated the Mahabharata. He translated the Hitopadesha. But most importantly, in 1885, he translated the Bhagavad Gita into English. It was called the Song Celestial, and it became the defining text for Mahatma Gandhi. And throughout Mahatma Gandhi's life, he referred to the Song Celestial. He always encouraged his family, his friends, his colleagues to read Edwin Arnold's The Song Celestial, the English translation of the Bhagavad Gita. So Edwin Arnold is a very important figure in popularizing Sanskrit literature, and he became a very important figure in the world of Oriental learning. He was not a scholar, he was a journalist. For 2.5 years, he was principal of the Pune College, which later became the Deccan College, where he was here in India between 1857 and 1860. And this is where he developed his knowledge of Sanskrit, of Arabic, of Persian, and of course, of Marathi as well. So this is both a two-in-one biography. It's a biography of a poem. It's a biography of the poet. The poem is important because it deals with the life of the Buddha. The poet is important because he was a very influential translator of Sanskrit texts who popularized Sanskrit literature, which got popular in the West, came back to India and influenced an early generation of Indians who were more comfortable with English than in their own languages. And a prime example of this, of course, is the influence that the Song Celestial, the English translation of the Bhagavad Gita, had on the life of Mahatma Gandhi. So this is really a labor of love as far as I am concerned, as somebody who's fascinated with the life of the Buddha, as somebody who looks upon Buddha as a figure who preached the values of science, of logic, of reasoning, of experimentation, of equality. It was a great experience for me to write this book, and I am really privileged and delighted that the Birla Academy has given me this opportunity for having this discussion on the book. I'm also doubly privileged that His Excellency the Governor is present here amidst all his various other engagements. He has found time to attend this presentation. So I'm really delighted, and I hope some of you will get an opportunity of reading this book and look at its extraordinary impact it has had across the world, but most importantly in India as well. So maybe Malavika can now we can start our conversation.
Thank you, Jairamji. That was very comprehensive. So it makes my job a little tougher because you've covered so many points, but it also opens up certain avenues through which we can explore the impact the Light of Asia had in India over the 20th century and indeed all over the world, particularly the United States of America. So in your talk, you'd mentioned the fact that it had a political impact, it had a cultural impact, and it had a social impact in India. So let me start by the impact of the Light of Asia. You've mentioned several people have mentioned that they read it or they read other translations by Sir Edwin. So we had this conversation, Jairamji and myself, about the greatest Indians of all time. And he had mentioned B.R. Ambedkar as one of his top 5, while I think that was the only place we disagreed, while I'd said Raja Ram Mohan Roy. So perhaps we could start with how the Light of Asia impacted B.R. Ambedkar through Kosambi, as you have mentioned in your book, and how it impacted his view on the Buddha, which is a view that eventually shaped his whole philosophy.
Well, unlike Vivekananda, unlike Tagore, unlike Gandhi, unlike Nehru, uh, Ambedkar saw Buddha as a political figure. He saw him as a social revolutionary. To the others, as I mentioned, Buddha was a figure of spirituality. Buddha was a figure of ethics. Buddha was a figure of philosophy. And ultimately, as you know, by the 8th century, Buddha becomes part of the Vishnu avatar. He becomes the 9th avatar of Vishnu by the 9th century. But to Ambedkar, Buddha meant something more. And that something more was that Buddha rejected caste prejudices. He rejected caste barriers. In the poem, there is a very moving section where Siddhartha is wanting to drink water, and there is a Shudra boy willing to give him wanting to give him water, but resisting to give water to Siddhartha. And Siddhartha says, "Why aren't you giving me the water?" And he says, "Because I am an untouchable. And you belong to a different caste." And Buddha says, "No, you have the same blood as I." And then he gives a long discourse that these are all prejudices, these are all barriers, these are all man-made barriers. And finally, the untouchable boy, gives water to Siddhartha. And that section in the Light of Asia was used by Ambedkar, the Dharmanand Kosambi, and the social reformers to really make Buddha the inspiration for their social reform movements, which began in the early part of the 20th century. And of course, as you know, Ambedkar and his followers formally embraced Buddhism. And a book that was published immediately following Dr. Ambedkar's death was called The Buddha and His Dhamma. Ambedkar became a Buddhist in the formal sense. Vivekananda, on the other hand, saw Buddha as a Vedantin. Vivekananda has repeatedly said that the Light of Asia is a text of Vedanta. So Vivekananda saw Buddha in the Hindu context, in the larger Vedanta context, whereas Ambedkar saw him in a different political context. So I think these are different interpretations of the Buddha, but there is no doubt that Buddha is really the greatest Indian. He's the greatest historical Indian that we have had in 3,000 years. And today, there is no part of Asia, Sri Lanka, Myanmar, Thailand, Cambodia, Vietnam, Japan, Korea, China, which is, where you don't feel, where you don't see, where you don't sense the influence of Buddha and his teachings. So Buddha is really a global figure. He's a subcontinental figure. He was born in what is now Nepal. He did his first sermon in Sarnath. He died in Kushinagara. But he's a subcontinental figure. Great Buddhist excavations have taken place in Pakistan, in what is now Bangladesh. And of course, Buddhism is the main religion practiced in Sri Lanka. So while Buddhism has died out in India, Buddha has not died out. The image of, there is no Indian home where you won't find this, Malvika. In almost every Indian home, you will find a painting or a little, stone carving or something of the Buddha in every home. And that shows that while Buddhism has faded out of India for complex reasons, Buddha continues to, captivate and enchant us. We're all prisoners of the Buddha in many ways.
Happy ones, I may add. So the other personality, but I would just broad base it a bit, whom I would like you to talk us through the impact this poem had on Rabindranath Tagore as a poet, as well as the great Abanindranath Tagore, who then went on to paint a scene which you think he was inspired to paint because of the light of Asia between Siddhartha and Sujata. So could you just talk us through how the Tagores, the great Tagores, looked at
before
poets?
Tagore, we had the influence on Ramakrishna, on Sri Ramakrishna himself, and subsequently on Swami Vivekananda. And that is not necessarily, Vivekananda read The Light of Asia in its English, but it was the Bengali translation of The Light of Asia by Girish Chandra Ghosh, Buddha Charito, which was published in 1885. And Ramakrishna was somebody who listened to the Bengali translation. And there are recorded instances in Mahendranath Gupta's biography, The Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna, where he writes how Sri Ramakrishna would go into a trance when listening to the translation of The Light of Asia. And of course, in the collected works of Vivekananda, there are numerous references to the influence of The Light of Asia. And Buddha and Vivekananda keeps talking about the Buddha and the influence of the Buddha in India and also to American audiences. Now, as far as Tagore is concerned, the Tagore family was steeped in Buddhism. Tagore's grandfather, Tagore's father, Tagore's brothers, and Rabindranath himself, deeply, deeply influenced by Buddhism. Abanindranath Tagore, of course, there is this famous painting, the Sujata, the encounter between Siddhartha and Sujata, which is immortalized in a painting of Abanindranath. But Rabindranath Tagore, there are many compositions of his which are directly derived from the influence of the Buddha. And there is a Bengali poetry, a Bengali poem that has been translated for the first time for me by a professor in Shantiniketan, which is directly derived from influence of the Light of Asia. And not only that, Tagore goes to Bodh Gaya in 1922 and gives a public appeal that the site of the Buddha's enlightenment, of Siddhartha's enlightenment, where Siddhartha became the Buddha, should be under the control of the Mahabodhi Society. This is a place sacred to the Buddhists across the world, and the Buddhist community, the Sri Lankan, the Myanmaris, the Vietnamese, the Thais, the Japanese, and of course the Indians should have control over the Mahabodhi temple. So there is a great, great influence in Bengal. But one difference I will make, Malvika, in Bengal, the influence of the Light of Asia is more literary, more cultural, more philosophical. But in Malayalam and in Tamil and in Hindi, the influence of the Light of Asia is more political, is more social.
You would possibly add Marathi to that as well.
Marathi as well. And that's because the caste system was not as firmly entrenched in Bengal as it was in South India, as it was in Maharashtra, for example. Bengal has traditionally been a society, and this is perhaps because of the influence of Buddhism. You know, the last great Buddhist dynasty we have had, emperor dynasty we have had in India, is the Pala dynasty, you know, which ruled from what is now Bengal. So Bengal has been free, has been relatively free of caste barriers, caste hierarchies, caste prejudices, as compared to, say, the southern part of the country or the western part of the country. And that's why the Light of Asia appealed to Ramakrishna, appealed to Tagore, appealed to Vivekananda, not as a text of social revolution, but as a text of philosophy, as a text of poetry, as a text extolling the ethical values. See, ultimately, Buddha preached ethical values. He didn't preach a religion. It is Ashoka who used Buddha to establish the foundations of what we now call Buddhism. But Buddha didn't say, I am a god. Buddha didn't say, follow me. Buddha said, here is a system of personal ethics. Here is a system of personal morality. Search for it yourself. Be your own light. Be your own lamp. And that's why I think Buddha appealed to so many people across the world, including Indians.
So I was going to ask you, I believe Girish Ghosh's translation was the second after Dutch translation.
Yes, first
Yes.
Indian translation,
Was by
first
Girish
Indian
Ghosh.
language translation. There was a Dutch translation earlier, but there was the first English to Bengali into an Indian language was Bengali, and subsequently, of course, there were two other translations into Bengali. But the most influential translation was Girish Ghosh, and Girish Ghosh is really the Bhishma Pitamaha of Bengali drama, of Bengali theatre. In fact, the biography of Girish Ghosh, it's called A Bohemian Devotee of Ramakrishna. There were two of the greatest devotees of Ramakrishna. One was Vivekananda and the other one was Girish Chandra Ghosh. And Girish Chandra Ghosh and Vivekananda were very, very close friends. And there's a lot of... Vivekananda, of course, read The Light of Asia in the original English, whereas Ramakrishna would have the Bengali translation sung out to him.
The next part of our conversation, I would like to talk about the Mahabodhi Society and the Bodh Gaya Temple. But before that, one of the a large portion of your book is devoted to Sir Edwin Arnold's popularity alongside the poem in the United States of America. How did this poem travel to America? And as you've mentioned, it was at a time when there was skepticism about religion. There was a disenchantment, and this was a more humane look at being ethical rather than religious. So do you think this is what made the book travel across Europe and the message of Buddha as well?
No, this was a period, late 19th century, where there was a growing disenchantment with the organized church, with the papacy, with organized religion, and people were looking for something different. People were looking for spiritual anchors. People were looking for ethical anchors. And in Buddha, the world found that anchor. Buddha was a pre-Christ, Christ-like figure, you know. A lot of similarities in many ways, other than the fact that Buddha didn't perform any miracles, and Arnold kept himself aloof from projecting Buddha as a miracle worker. The only miracle that Buddha worked in Arnold's poetry is that, you know, the Four Noble Truths, the Eightfold Path, a system of personal morality and personal ethics. I think this is what made the poem such a sensation in Europe, and it went to America. It introduced America to Buddhism. In fact, this is one of the triggers for the interest in Buddhism. And of course, later on, Malvika, one has to admit that in the last 50 years, it's the Dalai Lama who has kept the flag of the Buddhism flying high across the world. And I'm very fortunate and I'm very privileged that the Dalai Lama has written the foreword to this book, a very short foreword, but a very beautiful and very moving forward. And it's really the Dalai Lama today who represents Buddhism. But remember, Tibetan Buddhism is only one part of what we understand to be Buddhism. There are different varieties of Buddhism, and the Tibetan Buddhism is only one part. However, the Dalai Lama is today seen to be, the representation of the values and the ethics that the Buddha preached. So it became popular because people were disenchanted with the organized church. People were looking for a system of personal ethics. People were looking for an emotional anchor. And in India, people were looking for social reformers. Let's not forget, ultimately, the reason why the Light of Asia became so popular in Indian language after language is because people were looking for something not only to confront the Britishers with, but also to confront the upper castes, the caste prejudices, the caste orthodoxy. And in the Light of Asia, in the life of Buddha, they found that social message.
Can you hear me? Yes.
Yeah, I
So
can hear
the other aspect that you have covered is that Sir Edwin was possibly the first person to visit the Bodh Gaya temple and be troubled by what he saw as a lack of piety towards one of Buddhism's holiest sites. And it was in the late 19th century that this movement to balance the Mahant's sway over Bodh Gaya temple with the Buddhist claim to it happened. So would you say this was an important point? He then corresponded with successive viceroys about this, and it was eventually also taken up by the Indian leaders. And in 1953, as you mentioned, a trust was formed which had both Hindu as well as Buddhist representatives. So can you just talk us through this and the role of Angarika Dharmapala, who is beautifully traced in your book?
In 1886, February 1886, Edwin Arnold comes to India. Edwin Arnold comes to India in November 1885, and it's a 100-day trip. He comes to Kolkata as well. He comes to Calcutta at that time, not Kolkata, and he saw an English version of the Light of Asia being staged by Girish Chandra Ghosh, based on the Bengali translation of the Light of Asia in a theater called the Star Theater, which of course no longer exists. But it's an icon. It's a sort of a landmark of Calcutta's literary life. And then he goes to Bodh Gaya in February, early February 1886, and he sees the manner in which the Mahabodhi temple is being managed, the Vajrasana, the place where the Buddha sat under the peepal tree and got the enlightenment, was not managed properly, was not maintained properly. And Edwin Arnold is appalled that what he calls the Mecca of Buddhism is being treated in this cavalier way by the Mahants, who had control over the temple for the past 300 years or 250 years. And he starts a newspaper campaign. He starts writing about it in British newspapers. And it's then taken forward by the Sri Lankan scholar monk Dharmapala, who incidentally was spent more time in Calcutta than he spent in Ceylon. Dharmapala founded the Mahabodhi Society. He had very influential backers, Bengali backers. Tagore was one of his great supporters. And incidentally, the two great stars, the two great heroes in Chicago in September 1893, the World Parliament of Religions, one was Vivekananda and the other was Dharmapala. And there is a beautiful photograph in my book of Dharmapala and Vivekananda sitting next to each other at this Chicago's World Parliament of Religions. So Dharmapala then begins to, start this campaign, which culminates finally in 1953 with this joint management committee for managing the Mahabodhi temple. And to Dharmapala, India owes a great debt of gratitude, because Dharmapala was very keen that India rediscover its lost Buddhist heritage. the revival of Sarnath, the restoration of Sarnath, and of course, the revival and restoration at Bodh Gaya owe a lot to Dharmapala. And Dharmapala died in India. He died in Sarnath. And his last wish before he died was that he wished he was born back into a Brahmin family of North India. So it's ironic, that a man who fought this battle, for the restoration of Buddhist sites is expressing this last wish. But however, I think the movement was very important. Tagore supported the control. Vivekananda and Nivedita, I think, believed that the Mahabodhi temple was sacred both to the Hindus and to the Buddhists. And ultimately, that was what the solution that came about. It was joint control between the Hindus and the Buddhist community. There are some Buddhist organizations who continue to agitate for total 100% Buddhist control over the Mahabodhi temple. But the compromise solution, which was worked out after years of negotiation, finally in May of 1953, was this 50-50 control between, in a committee between Hindus and the Buddhists, with the local DM of Gaya district as the chairperson. So I think there is a model to be had there in the manner see, Malvika, most sacred places in India are sacred to people of all religions. There are many sacred spots in India which Hindus go, Buddhists go, Jains go, Muslims go, Christians go. So one of the great strengths of Indian civilization has been it's been boundaryless. People are comfortable with multiple identities. It has been liminal in nature. So to say that this spot is sacred only for Hindus or only for Buddhists or only for Islam or only for Christians or only for Jains in India is not true. Because in India, sacredness is a concept that embraces people of different faiths, of different. Religion is a modern concept. In many ways, religion is a Western concept. In India, we never had a concept of an organized church. We never had a concept of a one single holy book. We never had a concept of one founder, right? Our philosophy has been Sanatana Dharma in many ways. So it's been an all-embracing type of a philosophy. So we have to be careful here. But I think the solution that came up in Bodh Gaya was the right solution, because Hindus also pray in Bodh Gaya, Buddhists also pray in Bodh Gaya. And it's sacred for the Buddhists because that was the site of the Buddha's enlightenment. So I think this is a model that, while every sacred site has its unique history and its unique circumstances, I think what sacred sites in India need is collectivity. It doesn't require ownership by one person, but it's sacred to all Indians. I think that's a very important, powerful lesson we learn from the Bodh Gaya experience.
Okay. So since Sir Edwin did play a very crucial role in that, you've mentioned that he may have been quite satisfied with the final resolution of the movement that he had initiated, but you were not so sure about Dharmapala's reaction.
Well, I think Edwin Arnold wanted 100% Buddhist control. Dharmapala wanted 100% Buddhist control. But, Indians are great experts in 50-50 solutions, So what was the solution in Bodh Gaya was a 50-50 solution, 50% Hindu community, 50% Mahabodhi representatives. And I think that was the best solution, frankly, that was possible under the circumstances.
Right. So you mentioned that, while this is a biography of a poem, a book, it would by extension also be a biography of an author. And he is truly a fascinating person because there are many times when he is a loyalist to the empire to the bone, and then there are times when he seems so enamored of the Orient I mean, not a pre-said Orientalism, that he marries a person from Japan. He keeps wanting to come back to India. So can you just tell us, and there is some controversy, you yourself got into a correspondence with the eminent author Amit Chaudhary on the literariness of Sir Edwin. So what did you glean from your research about the man, and also talk us through his Bhopal legacy that still lives on?
Well, let me say, and this is where I disagree with.
Just before you start, I would also request our friends on this chat to post questions if they have any.
Well, I'll just say this, Malvika, and this is where I differ with my friend Shashi Tharoor and my colleague Shashi Tharoor. I think there was a generation of British scholars who believed in British rule in India, but who saw the value of Indian civilization, who were enamored, captivated, enchanted by Sanskrit literature, by our philosophical legacy, by our cultural legacy, by our literary legacy. I don't think Sir Edwin Arnold translated the Bhagavad Gita in order to justify British rule in India. I don't think Sir Edwin Arnold wrote The Light of Asia in order to justify British rule in India. I mean, they were contradictory personalities. They were people who believed in British rule. They believed in British Raj. They believed in, Queen Victoria and the Victorian project to modernize India. But at the same time, they were people deeply in love with Persian, with Arabic, with Sanskrit, with Pali, with Marathi, with Bengali. And so there was that generation. Today it's fashionable to criticize all of them as colonialists. But I do not. In my book, I am very careful to say that Arnold is an imperialist, he's a Victorian, he's a believer in British rule in India. He realized that the British will have to leave India sometime, but he left that time undefined. But at the same time, he was completely in love with Indian literature, with Indian culture. He was not sensitive to Indian political aspirations, but he was extraordinarily sensitive to Indian cultural legacy. And I think this is the contradiction in the personalities of people like Sir Edwin, whom we tend to today, in the cancel culture today, he was a colonialist, he was a Victorian. But I think there was more to it than that. And I don't think that they did what they did in terms of their contributions because they were wanting to justify British rule in India. So he's a fascinating character. I mean, for example, one of the things that, he's a great defender of sati. And he's very critical of Raja Ram Mohan Roy and Lord William Bentinck for the legislation to abolish sati. And he said that sati is a reflection of nobility, chastity, honesty, love. And there's a poem that he wrote, a very famous poem called A Rajput Wife, which got translated into Hindi. It became a Hindi play, a Hindi drama called Neel Devi by Bharatendu Harishchandra, a great figure lit in the Hindi cultural world. Now, I couldn't understand this. Here is a modern man, believer in science, believer in modernity, praising, defending sati, and saying that sati was a practice not just in vogue in India, but even in the ancient Romans. And he dug out ancient Latin literature to justify the continuation of sati. So I mean, there were a lot of contradictions, in the man. But I think fundamentally, Malvika, his value lay in the fact that whether it was Hitopadesha, whether it was Mahabharata, whether it was Gita Govinda, whether it was the Bhagavad Gita, and of course the Light of Asia, he belonged to a generation that brought into the attention of the world these great literary treasures and gems of Indian civilization. And it made Indians themselves aware. I mean, Gandhi writes in his autobiography that my introduction to Bhagavad Gita came from reading Sir Edwin's translation the song Celestial. What better example can you find of his influence than what Gandhi himself writes in his autobiography? So there is Edwin Arnold is a contradictory personality, no doubt. He was, as I said, an imperialist, but he was also somebody who was deeply in love with Indian culture, with Indian civilization, with Indian legacies in different forms, and it is exemplified in his translations and his writings. Now, I discovered in the process of doing my research that he had a son called Channing Arnold. Channing Arnold came to Burma, what was then Burma. Then he became a tutor to the royal family in Bhopal. He married a local Muslim lady in Bhopal. He had two children, settled down in Sultanpur in UP, was murdered in 1937 over a property dispute. And Channing Arnold had two children. One was Rafiq, who was brought up as a Muslim in Bhopal, and a daughter called Grace, Sajida, who became Grace, who was brought up by a Christian missionary couple. And the descendants of Rafiq Arnold, the grandchildren of Rafiq Arnold, are today in Bhopal. And whereas the descendants of Grace Arnold are somewhere in Australia, Thailand, and England. So I was able to trace the descendants of Sir Edwin Arnold, and they have names like Muhammad Arnold. They have names like Fauzia Sultana Arnold. Another name is Farooq Khan Arnold. So wonderful, what William Dalrymple calls the white moguls. Channing Arnold was quite clearly a white mogul. So to find Sir Edwin and Arnold's descendants with these wonderfully syncretic names like Muhammad Arnold, like Farooq Arnold, I think Sir Edwin Arnold would certainly be very happy that his great grandchildren are sitting in Bhopal today with these names, half Christian names, half Islamic names. So it was wonderful.
Fantastic. So now we've got some questions streaming in. There's Ayan Haldar who's asked, Sir, do you believe that the two perspectives on the Buddha that you pointed out, the political and the spiritual, in the context of caste, are in conflict with each other?
No, they are different perspectives. See, all of us have a vision of Buddha in our minds, that Siddhartha gave up family life. Siddhartha gave up Yashodhara and Shuddhodana and Rahula because of foresights. He saw a cripple, he saw an old man, he saw a corpse, and he saw a monk. This is what is called the foresights school, which is what led Siddhartha to say, I must find the meaning of life. And he started this life of renunciation and finally became the Buddha. Now, there was another set of Indians, Dharmanand Kosambi, for example, and Dr. Ambedkar, who rejected this foresights view, who said that Siddhartha did not give up his princely life because of seeing these four sights, but because the tribes to which his father belonged and the tribe to which his mother belonged were fighting with each other over control over water. And Siddhartha's attempts at reconciliation, at bringing about peace between the two warring tribes failed. And fed up with his clansmen of belonging to his father, fighting with the clansmen belonging to his mother over control of water, Siddhartha gave up his life. Now, that's a bit of a Marxist interpretation. It has nothing to do with a corpse, a cripple, an old man, or a monk. It has to do with control over some common property resources. So this is a different interpretation of the Buddha. Now, which is the right interpretation of the Buddha? It depends entirely on you. It's your pick. I would say that 99.99% of us believe in the foresights school of the Buddha. But there is this group of Ambedkar, of Kosambi, and many other social revolutionaries who believed that Siddhartha gave up princely life not because of the four sides, but because he was fed up with the fighting that was going on over control of water, and he was unable. People were not willing to listen to him. He was anguished and pained by the continued aggression being shown by his father's family and his mother's family against each other. I personally, if you ask me personally, I tend to believe in the Ambedkar Dharmanand Kosambi school. I believe we have romanticized Buddha to saying he saw an old man, he saw a cripple, he saw a corpse, he saw a monk, and then he said, "Oh, what is the meaning of life?" I think that's a bit of a That's my personal view. That he's romanticized our view of Siddhartha, who became the Buddha. So I'm closer to the Ambedkar Kosambi school, but that's my private view.
Yeah, so perhaps the best path to traverse in true Buddhist style would be the middle path, where we take the four sides to be metaphors of what we get out of the Buddha, and perhaps the Ambedkar view is what is more true and more intellectually sound, but I don't think either one is entirely true.
I think Buddha's greatest contribution, by the way, is the middle path. I think the Indian path is the middle path. We must find the middle path in economics. We must find the middle path in politics. We must find the middle path in all aspects of human endeavor and activity. I'm a great believer in the middle path. And I think this is Buddha's greatest contribution. The other thing that I should mention, Malvika, that Edwin Arnold's poem became very powerful because it completely demolished this notion of nirvana as a nihilistic or a negative concept. And it was the first work that showed that nirvana was really an active, a very dynamic concept. And that what Buddha said, be in the world, but not of the world. I think that was the concept behind nirvana. And if you don't mind, I just want to read out the last few lines of The Light of Asia. The last few lines, which really summarize and convey to you the beauty of the poem and the impact that it had. Edwin Arnold, at the end of the poem, at the end of 40,000 lines, writes, "Ah, blessed Lord, O high deliverer, forgive this feeble script which doth thee wrong, measuring with little wit thy lofty love. Ah, lover, brother, guide, lamp of the law, I take my refuge in thy name and thee. I take my refuge in thy law of good. I take my refuge in thy order. Om." And these are the immortal last four lines. "The dew is on the lotus. Rise, great sun, and lift my leaf and mix me with the wave. Om Mani Padme Hum. Om Mani Padme Hum." The sunrise comes, the dewdrop slips into the shining sea. And this is how the poem ends. And I think, this is really beautiful, and it brings out that nirvana, it does not mean destruction. Nirvana doesn't mean abnegation. Nirvana doesn't mean withdrawal. It's a very active concept. So this middle path, no. I think middle path is very difficult to be the middle. It's easy to be on the one side. It's easy to be on the other. It's the most difficult to be in the middle path, because you can be run over from both sides.
Yes. So there are many questions, but I just thought I'll draw your attention to two. One is about, given the acknowledged prominence of the Pragya Paramita literature in Buddhism across many countries, why do we still have no reliable editions, let alone translations? This is from Apala Datta.
Well, you asked me a highly technical question, and as I said,
Yes.
I am not a scholar of Buddhism or Buddhist history, but I'll just say this, But Edwin Arnold, by the way, and this is the, the reflection of the state of our own literature. There's a lot of Edwin Arnold's sources were, of course, English sources, but English sources translated from the original Chinese or the Pali. The original Sanskrit has been lost, but the Chinese is available, the Pali is available, and those then get translated into French, and then they get translated into English. And that's how Edwin Arnold was able to access, many works of the Buddha. The original Sanskrit, many of the original Sanskrit works have indeed been lost, but the Pali has been preserved, and the Chinese texts have been preserved. So it's very ironical. I mean, you look at Xuanzang, for example. Much of what we know about our geography is derived from Xuanzang's account of his visit to India in the 7th century, or Fahian, who came 4 centuries earlier. And that's one of the reasons is, we are largely an oral culture. We have rarely been a written culture. In fact, whatever written culture we've had is thanks to the Buddhists. It was the Buddhist contribution to our traditions and to our civilization has been the concept of writing, actually, in many ways. Remember, our culture has been either smriti, which is what we remember, or shruti, what we hear, not necessarily lipi, what we write. I think that was another great contribution from the Buddhist traditions.
Okay, I'll just punch 2 questions together. One is part comment. Kanika Sharma, so does it mean that Buddha's actual search was to find the true happiness in the midst of daily life struggles and obstacles without losing the path of peace? And Anjana Saha's question is more related to the poem we are discussing. Is the Light of Asia more about a philosophy or way of life?
The Light of Asia is about the humanity of Buddha. It's about the Buddha, the person. It's not about Buddha, the God. And there are 8 books in the Light of Asia, from the birth of Siddhartha till his teaching, his first sermon at Sarnath. It doesn't deal with Kushinagara, it stops at the Sarnath. So it deals with ethics, it deals with morality, it deals with the teachings of the Buddha. Not with the dogma, not with the creed, not with the religion, not with the ism. The ism comes after Ashoka. Really, it's a post-Ashokan institution. So, it deals with the philosophy of Buddha. It deals with his approach. And as I kept saying, that it's important to recognize the Buddha didn't become a Buddha by following the Buddha. There was no Buddha for him to follow. He followed his own. In fact, he rejected many of his attempts at understanding. We all know the story of how he rejected the path of self-mortification. In fact, there is a very famous Buddha, which is there today in the Lahore Museum, all skin and bones Buddha, the man who fasted. He gave up that approach. So yes, I think in answer to the first question, and I said this, be in the world, but not of the world. Be in the world, anchored in a system of personal ethics, personal morality. See, morality, in fact, in my view, the large part of our civilization, ethics has been situational. But Buddha was perhaps the first person to say that there is no such thing as situational ethics. There is a thing as a permanent set of ethics, which cuts across situations, which cuts across people. So yes, I mean, it's a system, and that's why Buddha is popular. I think that's why it became popular in the West. That's why the West, Buddha became a sensation in the later part of the 19th century, in the early part of the 20th century. It is because it appealed to the individual. It didn't appeal to the collective. The church is a collective, whereas Buddha was giving you a sense of the individual.
So I think that has covered a lot of your very fascinating book, and a book that really takes us back to a poem that should be rediscovered in our times. Once we leave this chat, many of you will be delighted to know that India has won its first Olympics medal in the form of a silver by weightlifter Mirabai. And that's happened in Tokyo, where Sir Edwin Arnold spent some time and even married.
His third
Now,
wife was a Japanese, by the way. Yeah. You know, after he became, after his love affair with India, he's developed this great fascination for Japan. And the Light of Asia became a huge sensation in Japan. And, you know, Buddhism, very much part of Japanese society. Buddha is very much part of Japanese society.
yes. So over to you, Jayashree ji and Maitri, to conclude this session.
Thank you, Jairam ji. Thank you, Malvika, for this fantastic talk. Between the two of you, you really gave us such a wonderful insight into the book and the life of Buddha. So many new facts. It was really amazing. And I think, you know, there were about 154 people and just one left. So that is another indication of how interesting and how wonderful both of you were. Thank you so much again.
Thank you. I apologize for the power breakdown.
No, not at all.
I mean,
That happens all the time, believe me.
that
it
should
happens
show
all
to
the
you that even MPs are not immune to such vagaries.
time.
But there
Okay.
is a popular belief that, you know, we enjoy immunity from things like power cuts. So, so I apologize to you that,
Not at all, Jairam ji.
that I went offline. And I
I
really
guess
wish,
the Light of Asia brought us back on track.
So Maitri would also like to say
I
something.
wish to thank
please.
Maitri and I wish to thank Jayashree ji for giving me this opportunity. It's a great privilege for me to be part of the Birla Academy's activities. And I look forward
Absolutely.
coming to Kolkata and visiting the
Yes.
museum next time.
I hope that is soon, after the lockout and the COVID and all that.
It's
Definitely.
really been a wonderful afternoon, sir. And as you can see, there are still many questions by the audience which are unanswered. So clearly, it's not enough to just spend this much time with you. I really wish we can have more sessions. And
Maitri,
I really-
can I make a suggestion that
Yes,
those
sir.
of you who want to send me an email on any questions, please, you know, my email, please share my email, and I would be glad to
Okay.
receive any emails, and I would respond to each one of them individually myself.
Oh, nice.
That'd be
very nice.
lovely, sir. Sir,
Yeah.
I'll just share your email ID on the chat after the session. So whoever has any questions can directly email
Sure.
you.
That's
And
wonderful.
just want to add that as His Holiness the Dalai Lama has commented in the foreword of your book, the message of the Buddha is timeless, eternal, and relevant. And you, Mr. Ramesh, have managed to revive that message through your immense research on Sir Edwin Arnold and his book. I must admit that I was enthralled when I read Light of Asia by Sir Edwin Arnold. But after reading your book, the poem became all the more relevant, and I connected to it even more through all the references and research, and now through this conversation. So it's really a service, actually, you know, for our generation who were not really aware of the book which was published in 1879, but you've completely revived it. So you are also responsible for a revival of Buddhism in some sense. So thank you so much, sir. Malvika Di, thank you for your wonderful and warm association with us. And I hope to collaborate with you in many such relevant conversations. And thanks to the audience who've been so engaged and interested. Thank you, Governor, sir, for always supporting our ventures. And hope to see you all in future events. Thank you so much. I'm just going to put sir's email ID on the chat, and then everybody can leave.
Please.
Thank
Thank you,
you.
everyone. Have a good weekend.
Thank you
so
very much.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, Governor Sahab. Namaskar.
Thank you, Your Excellency. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'll respond to all the emails, whoever sends me an email.
All right. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Malvika. Thank you, Maitri. Thank you,
Thank you,
Jayashree.
sir.
Thank you.
Thank you.